Good afternoon and welcome to this British Academy event. Today we are celebrating the 2020 winning book of the Nayef Al-Rodhan Prize for Global Cultural Understanding, Professor Emeritus Hazel Carby's Imperial Intimacies, A Tale of Two Islands. I'm particularly delighted to be introducing this because Hazel and I met back when it was published, and I've become a complete advocate of it, and I've been banging on everybody's table saying you've got to give this book a prize, and lo, it has come to pass. And this is a particularly good prize. It's worth £25,000, and it's the British Academy's way of recognising the enormous contributions to the public understanding of world cultures by non-fiction authors from across the world. It was founded and has up till this year been generously sponsored by the neuroscientist and international relations scholar, Professor Nayef Al-Rodhan, with the first award made in 2013. I'm very pleased to announce that the nominations for this year's prize, which is now renamed the British Academy Book Prize for Cultural Understanding, are now open, and the submissions deadline is the 31st of March. So please visit the British Academy's website for further details as to how to nominate if you're interested in doing so. However, today, over the next 30 minutes, we're going to explore with Hazel cultural identity, why it matters, and how we can move forward in these deeply troubled times. Towards the end of the event, we'll be taking a selection of audience questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. It just remains for me now to welcome Hazel Carby. Hazel, it's very good to see you again.
It's good to see you again, and thank you very much for banging on those doors.
I think I didn't actually introduce myself, which is my usual thing with these events. My name's Claire Armitstead, and I'm a culture editor at The Guardian, in which context I interviewed Hazel first time round. So Hazel, this is a really unusual book because it's both an imperial history and a personal memoir. And I know we now live in a world of memoir come histories, but some of the storytelling decisions you've taken are genuinely unusual. Tell us about what your project is and how you came to write it.
So it was clear to me from the beginning, actually, that if I wanted to change, to transform the usual historical narratives of empire, whether that's on the sort of wider stage or whether it's particularly in relation to Jamaica and Britain. If these stories that I wanted to tell were invisible, I had to try and imagine a different narrative form in which to tell them. So on the one hand, it is actually, a serious history. It's the product of 10 years of archival research. But on the other hand, I wanted to be able to take the archival research and make it accessible to a general readership. So I decided that one of the ways in which I could tell this story was to use my family history as a skeleton or a coat hanger, if you like, on which to hang a story that is really about the British Empire in its wider sense, about the relations between colonies and the metropole, but also between individual people. And that's why I decided fairly early on that I wanted to focus on the story of ordinary people. I think especially when we think of the relations between Britain and the colonies, where Britain was actually becoming incredibly wealthy on the produce by enslaved labor, that actually the story was usually told of, vast sugar plantations, of Britons who were the aristocracy, who had, very large land holdings both in Jamaica and in Britain. But the story I tell is very different to that. The story I tell is actually of a soldier, a young man, the son of a carpenter from Colby in Lincolnshire, who goes into the British Army during the beginning of the Revolutionary and then the Napoleonic Wars, and ends up on the shores of Jamaica, and, walks away from the army, travels to the other side of the island, the north coast, and actually starts to work on plantations and eventually becomes an owner of enslaved people himself on a small coffee plantation. And the point about telling this ordinary story, and the enslaved owner was Lily Carby, this is, one of my ancestors, was to point to the fact that what happened in Jamaica is not somehow completely estranged from what was happening in the UK. Trying to change the narrative of how we view colonial lives as somehow completely other to the metropole. If you think of those people in that village, in Colby, in Lancashire, from the mid-18th century through to the early 19th century, unbeknownst to them, I imagine, they actually had family in Jamaica. They had grandchildren, they had cousins, they had kin. But we don't usually think of the story in that way. So I tried to create these stories of people who I found out about in the National Archives of the UK and of Jamaica, but to bring their stories to an audience in a way that made them both alive, but also incredibly intimate. So the story actually starts in a post-war Britain, but it goes backwards 300 years to that owner of the enslaved in Portland in Jamaica, and then traces his roots back to Colby in Lincolnshire.
So let's just go into what he did, Carby. When he arrived, he bought a small coffee estate with 14 slaves on it. So we're not talking about one of the grand estates. There's no trace of it now, is there? Is that right?
No, you can actually go to exactly where it was. I have been to exactly where it was, and there are other coffee estates there. But there's no archaeological trace, or at least archaeologists have not recovered the traces as they have with some of the other plantations. That is true. But the sense of how those enslaved lived on that plantation, how in fact Lily Carby, before he became an owner of enslaved himself, worked on very large plantations in the area, sugar plantations in the area. You can actually, not only from the archives, but actually from the ecology of the place, from the environment, imagine what it was like to live there, how it was. I try to imagine, for example, how the enslaved were brought up from the coast into the hills of the Blue Mountains, which is where the plantation was, shackled through pathways through the forest, which are still there. So walking those places, one can imagine from their lives, the lives that historians have in fact uncovered, one can imagine them moving through that particular landscape. And of course, there's a lot of work that has been done by UCL and others on recovering all the sort of material details of plantations. And when I went to the Jamaica archives, I could find land records of the plantation. I could find Lily Carby's will. So I knew not only, exactly where the plantation was, but what it was producing. The coffee it produced over different years, the arrowroot, exact. And so I could translate those archival details into daily life.
So one of the things that you discovered was the details, such as they exist, of slaves. And there weren't many details, but one of the key ones was that some of them had his name and the others didn't have a surname. And this is where this story connects with you.
Yes. So his name is Lily Carby. When I first discovered that, I actually thought he must be a woman, my prejudices looking at these records. But actually, one of the things that led me to the plantation was a story that my father used to tell me. My father grew up in Kingston, Jamaica. He was born in 1922. He grew up with his grandmother. And he told me that every summer his grandmother took him from Kingston across the island to a place called Swift River, and that everybody there was called Carby. Now, as a child, your parents tell you lots of stories. You don't necessarily take notice of them. But I remembered this story when I was in the National Archives, and it was that story that led me to find the records of what are called slave registers. In 1815, the British government decided that it was going to count every single enslaved body. They didn't think of them as persons. Every single enslaved body throughout its entire empire. And registers had to be compiled by the owners of every single plantation. And there in the National Archives today, you can find those records. And so when I knew that I was looking for Swift River, I knew the area to look in, and the slave registers were account books, and accounts were every every sort of 3 years. So there are, names, there's the owner, there's who actually filled in the form, the register, if it was an attorney. The names, of course, are not the names that the enslaved named themselves. The names are the names that Lily Carby gave them. And indeed, a couple of them did carry the name Carby. But what was also astonishing to me was that the names he gave his 14 slaves were all actually drawn from family names in Colby in Lincolnshire. It completely surprised me. It took me a long time to try and imagine why on earth he had done that, because it clearly couldn't have just been for sentimental reasons. It was clearly a sort of stamp of ownership, I expect. The plantation itself was called Lincoln, after the city just north of Colby. But one of the things it enabled me to do was to actually confirm that I had found the right person when I found Lily Carby's baptismal records in the Lincolnshire archives, because there were all the family names that were reproduced on the slave register in 1816 when it was compiled and submitted. All the names of these slaves were exactly the same names as his family. From there, I had to figure out how on earth he actually got to Jamaica. I mean, I had no idea. And it wasn't until I was reading a local Lincolnshire historian, when he's talking about how Lincolnshire actually emptied out of young men, that I realized they were going into the militia. There were, constantly wars and skirmishes with France before the Revolutionary Wars began. And then the entire Lincolnshire regiment volunteered to go into the British Army. And that regiment, I found again in the National Archives in the UK, was shipped to the West Indies, to Jamaica.
And he fathered a lot of children, some of whom you've traced back as who became your father's forebears. But let's now just park that side of the story, because we said at the beginning it's a dual biography, and there's the other side of your family, which was simultaneously growing up in poverty in Bristol, in the West Country.
Yes.
In the UK.
So one of the other aspects of this story is actually to put the stories of Jamaica and the stories of the UK together. And one of the things that is evident from what I discovered is that within the UK, it also had its marginalized areas of poverty. That there's ways in which you can think about, the poverty in the UK and the poverty in Jamaica in ways that have conversations between them. One of these areas was health and health inequalities. There was tuberculosis, in fact, on both sides of the family. But also, what surprised me was on my mother's side of the family, the stories that came down to us were actually not of poverty. The stories that were passed on by my mother and by my relatives were stories of continual uplift, if you like, progress, constant progress and success, and that each generation was doing better than the next generation. On my mother's side, there are, people were leaving the West Country, going to Bristol. Her branch of the family, some of them actually went on to the railways, to the Great Western Railway. The Great Western Railway was a route upwards from agricultural labour to white-collar work. One of my uncles became an engine driver. So all the stories that were passed on to me was, here was Bristol, this city which produced, for our side of the family, success, and actually founded the ancestors that lived there, then went to South Wales because of the Great Western Railway, and founded a sort of, a middle class, or I should say lower middle class family that thought of itself as very successful. It wasn't until I actually went into the archives that I found out all the stories that they weren't telling me. My great-grandmother, my great-grandmother died in a Bristol workhouse, and she had to take her children in there with them. She was a seamstress. Her husband had died. She couldn't afford to feed them. And then I just went backwards and found a history of extraordinary poverty that actually in the end took me all the way back to Bath, to yet another family living in extreme poverty, a woman, my great-great-grandmother, who was a laundress, who lived in an extremely poor part of the city of Bath, but walked every day to the centre and washed the laundry of the wealthy who came to use the spas in Bath.
And your parents met. They were a part of the sort of great melting pot of the Second World War. Tell us about how they got together, because this is a sort of the next, moving it on to the next stage.
Well, so my mother actually had she had left home. She was actually working as a domestic for a wealthy family on the south coast. But when the war came, she went to her relatives in South Wales, and she in fact ended up joining the Air Ministry, and as such became a civil servant. That's one of the routes for her sort of personal advancement, if you like. So the war for her opened up many opportunities that she previously hadn't had, and she had a successful career in the Air Ministry. My father, who was living in very straitened circumstances, who had looked after his grandmother until she died, volunteered for the Royal Air Force in Kingston, Jamaica, and was transferred to Britain by convoy. And what happened was that he met my mother. The Air Ministry had transferred to Worcester to avoid the bombing of London, and he met my mother at a dance. Now, their story, I try and tell in terms of how they were not total strangers when they met. Both had received, an education in Britishness, a British education, a very similar curriculum. Both of them actually celebrated sort of Empire Day. Both of them, as very young people, 18 and 19, decided to actually, try and save the empire, if you like. So I talk about what the commonalities they had, because I think too frequently somehow people think, oh, colonial populations, they're completely other. The other side of the story is actually my on my maternal mother's side, reactions to their marriage, which was shock and horror, basically. No one would attend their wedding. And so one of the questions I had that I was constantly asking as I was going through the archives about this maternal family is, what on earth did they know about Jamaica? What did they know about Jamaicans? What did they think they knew about colonized people and Black people that made them so horrified that my mother would actually marry someone who was Jamaican and who was Black? So I try and unravel that puzzle in the book by thinking about how my maternal family in the UK, poor as they were, very, very poor as they were, actually got some benefit from imagining that they were white. How did that happen? How do these identities form? How do people attach some sort of belonging to these issues? So, I look at the popular culture surrounding them, about how my grandmother, was growing up in Bristol, surrounded by imperial spectacle of the armies, of spectacle of celebrating the empire on biscuit tins or all sorts of paraphernalia that the poor were given in school. You didn't have to pay money for these things. So even though they were very poor, their house would have been festooned with all sorts of paraphernalia, celebrating empire, celebrating Victoria, celebrating, the whole imperial entities. And also in their schools, they were, being shown lantern slides of empire. And I found one lantern slide that was a public lantern slide show in the city of Bristol. And I imagine what my grandmother would have learned if she actually went to that lantern slide show. It was a lantern slide show entirely about Jamaica. It was shown in 1905, and it was trying to both educate Britons about Jamaica in terms of imagining them as a future population of tourists. So at the time when they're actually starting to establish shipping bananas to the UK, they're also imagining, and Chamberlain was one of the brains behind this, that there would be an economic system then that on the boats back, empty of bananas, would be full of British tourists. So lantern slideshows went around the country showing these images of Jamaica. And basically Jamaica was imagined to be, on the one hand, a land of bounty, a garden, if you like, just to have produce for the UK, but on the other hand, a land of quote unquote beauty that tourists could appreciate. Now, all of that, of course, ignored the terrible poverty in Jamaica. It ignored the way in which Jamaica, which had been run as a crown colony directly, had been completely ignored. Health, paying poverty wages, Tate and Lyle. Actually, they weren't poverty wages; they were starvation wages. Tate and Lyle was one of the companies who did this. So when my father was growing up in Kingston, Jamaica, in the 1930s, they had all these protests and marches of the starving, literally the starving, and the Colonial Office was taking no notice of any of that. So I tie together the poverty, the health issues, tuberculosis on both sides of the divide. And that's why I want to keep the sort of sense that these stories are actually intimate. There's intimate relations between people, but there's intimate relations between, government legislation or governments actually ignoring their colonies and using them only for exploitation, which produce very, very intimate stories at the level of peoples and bodies suffering from the results of starvation wages.
One of the things you do in the book, and we'll do this quite quickly, I want to get it in because I love this part of the book, is you talk about English roundhand handwriting.
Oh, yes.
And this is a book that's full of fascinating sidesteps, disquisitions on Hazel mentioned bananas, but the one on English roundhand and the fact and the ledgers and and you have the wonderful phrase "empire is accounting." Tell us a bit about that before we open up to questions.
So I was telling you that in the National Archives, I discovered these registers of the enslaved on the plantation. But of course, although they seem to be full of information, lists, females, males, children, names that were actually given them by the slave owner, not their own names, I realized that these registers didn't tell me anything that I really wanted to know. So I thought a long time about what they did know. And one of the things that struck me was how extraordinarily beautiful the handwriting was. Now, when I grew up in school, I was taught this handwriting, this English roundhand, and the principal of my school ingrained in me that, English character could be discerned through your handwriting, that if I didn't have anything else going for me, if I had beautiful handwriting, I could be, as she said, a person of accomplishment. And it struck me when I was in the National Archives, looking really at these completely inhuman registers, that there was a vast discrepancy between the beautiful handwriting, English character, and the fact that these people were being enslaved and listed as chattel simultaneously by these pens. And when I found out the whole process of how the registers were compiled, how they were copied, how, they were moved from Portland to Kingston, how they were copied again and then shipped to Britain, and I thought about, why Britain actually wanted to keep these registers, I realized that actually empire was maintained by vast armies of clerks. Not armies only in the sense of the military, but by a clerical workforce that somehow disguised the brutality of the daily life, horror and violence of a slave plantation into beautiful script. And of course, the clerks listing these names didn't think of the people that they were listing as human beings. It was entirely property. So this is how I came to the idea that, in fact, empire is accounting. We think of it as being military conquest, as being, the Navy shipping 12 million across the Atlantic, but it's also accountants, it's clerks keeping all the records. And the records they appear to give order to empire. I mean, you can see it there. They're all ledgers. They're listed. It appears extremely ordered, a reckoning accounted for. But actually what they were doing was to put order onto what was total disorder, beautiful handwriting onto absolute horror and violence. And this apparent order of these ledgers, they're in the National Archives. One can open them up. And if you think that is empire, rows and rows of columns that are beautifully written and added up, you cannot see the horror and the violence and the crimes against humanity that they are disguising. And so I had to think about, is this what was meant by British and English character?
Thank you very much. Now we've got questions pouring in, so I need to get to them before we run out of time. I've got one from Chris Hoff. I don't know quite. Sorry, pardon if I've mispronounced your name. Who says, given your background, how did you feel about the statue of Edward Colston? Did you welcome its removal? Of course, you're quite far away from it, aren't you? You're in Connecticut at the moment.
Oh, but I have spent a long, long time in Bristol, and for writing about the Bristol section of the book, I walked all around the city, not only despairing at the statue of Edward Colston and his relationship with the Society of Merchant Venturers, but also the way in which the city is, festooned with signs of enslavement that people pass by every day. And invisible, Guinea Street, even the way the streets are actually named. So I have spent a lot of time in Bristol. This was a city that my maternal family absolutely revered. And I've spent a lot of time uncovering its history and the way in which it has actually built an entire civic culture from the profits of enslavement. So, of course, I was thinking it was long overdue for the Colston statue to be removed in the way that it was. What I think is, what makes me angry, what makes me upset, is that 4 people now are going to be taken to the Crown Court for a sort of reckoning for what they did. But the reckoning that actually should happen is with the city, with the metropole, with the UK, for this unrecognised history of the way in which people profited from enslavement and still owe, if you like, the enslaved a vast amount of recognition of all sorts, including sort of reparations. So it's the wrong sort of reckoning to have these 4 people in a court, in a Crown Court. We should actually be having the reckoning with the way in which how not only people like Edward Colston, but actually the city of Bristol itself built a civic culture from the blood and the sweat and the tears of the enslaved on plantations. That's the reckoning we need.
So now, next one is, can you tell us a bit more about your book's opening question, where are you from, and what the meaning is behind it?
Oh, this is a question that I was constantly asked as a child. Where are you from? I grew up in Mitcham on an area that was really quite a vast council estate, one of the sort of post-war developments. And my brother and I were constantly being asked, where were we from? I mean, there was this, Jamaican father, this black man, this white woman. That was horror enough. But even piling on that, there were these, mixed race children. We were called a lot worse than that, actually. But I was always being asked, so where are you from? And I would say, well, I was born in Devon, which I was. And they would say, but before that, I learned as a child, very young child actually, in school, that I could not be from Britain. People would not accept that I was there. In fact, people were horrified if I claimed to be British. Then I was revealed as this sort of complete aberration, the children of this unholy wedlock between a black man and a white woman, half caste. And so for a long time, I had to sort of struggle with all the different dimensions of this question, because it wasn't really a question that meant geography. They weren't really asking me where I was from in terms of, I lived in Mitcham or I was born in Devon or whatever. They were really asking me about where I fit in this fiction of Britishness, because this fiction of Britishness meant really that I couldn't fit. I had to be from somewhere else. So the opening of the book is about that sort of dilemma in this child, and she is a child. There's a certain distance between the narrator and this figure sort of remembering this child. But I tried to capture this child's total bewilderment, because she was being asked to justify her existence in a way she could not possibly do.
Mm-hmm. And it's something that went on into your adult life, your academic life, didn't it? You have a lovely story or not a lovely story of somebody asking you what a nice white woman like you is doing being professor of African American studies.
Yeah, so well, that's a real lesson in terms of how bodies are read. So when I first came to the United States, I was actually shocked. Nobody in the UK, in London or in Wales, where I used to spend my summers, had ever considered that I could possibly be white. So when I came to the United States and started to actually teach in a program in African American studies, I realized that there were a couple of things going on. One was that bodies can be read differently here. So you can't imagine that race always means exactly the same as you move around the world, or racialization means exactly the same. The other was that I actually moved into a situation where Black academics in the United States were in a very fraught relationship with predominantly white institutions. They were actually in a sort of territorial turf battle, if you like. And one of the venues for increasing the presence of Black academics in the United States was through this field, African American studies. And so in some ways, not only as a sort of Black Brit, but as someone of Caribbean heritage, I was something of an interloper. So this whole question of where are you from, I realized followed me throughout my life, but it wasn't always meant to be it wasn't always the same thing in terms of its meaning. So where in Britain there was this sort of fiction of a racial heritage, in the United States it was a very complicated picture of and question asking, what exactly are you doing here? So when I was asked by a very prominent Black male academic, what is a white woman like you doing, studying, or as an expert in the fiction of Black women writers, there was an awful lot at play in that question that I had to learn to unravel, all sorts of knots, if you like, that made me. I mean, the other question people are always asking is, what is this diaspora thing? What does it mean, diaspora? So if you actually sort of, at that time, now the term is a little more accepted, but at that time, if you actually thought of yourself as someone who was part of a Black diaspora, it didn't really register over here, because African American studies was built very much just around the United States, as if actually that totally defined the field. So this question has haunted me, but it hasn't always meant the same thing.
Leading on from that, very connected with that, is a question about your family story and how that has influenced your studies and you as a student and also as a teacher.
Well, one of the things I tried, yeah. I mean, you began by asking me about how this story is not necessarily told in the way that these stories have usually been told. It's not a conventional narrative. One of the things I tried to capture, actually, is that the narrator has different sorts of alliances and different sorts of affiliation and different types of motivations, I guess, in telling certain stories. And I try to incorporate that into the narrative. The child's life was in some ways quite traumatic, and so the girl, in a way, becomes a character that is not exactly the same as the person who's narrating the story. Then
so just to fill in to people who haven't, for people who haven't read it, Hazel has this way of writing where she refers to herself in the third person as a child, and only comes into the first person as she's talking from where you are absolutely now. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, but even that first person can be fractured. So I tell the story of being in the archives, for example, the one of, trying to find the slave registers. And the academic, the trained researcher, was sort of gung-ho to get to the roots of all these stories. But the daughter, the descendant of enslaved people, was not always sure that she wanted to find out, actually, what the researcher did. And so I tried to capture the tension between how I've been trained as a teacher, how I've been trained in literary studies, but also to capture the dismay I felt sometimes at what I was discovering. And when I actually came across the register of enslaved people on a plantation in Jamaica with the name Carby, I thought I was prepared for what I would feel, and I was totally unprepared. And it was completely heartbreaking and painful. So what I tried to capture in the book is those tensions. This is not just a narrator that is somehow, a unified narrator. She is fractured in all sorts of different ways and reacts differently to different parts of uncovering the story. And so that journey, the journey of this researcher, who is also, the daughter of Welsh Jamaican parents, is not exactly always the same person. And she has motives for finding out or for not finding out, just as her parents had motives for telling her or not telling her about certain things from the past. And I tried to capture the pain of that journey.
So I'm afraid we've run out of time now for more questions, but I just want you to just end with the story, this fantastic historical irony. There are so many historical ironies in this book. The irony of the church and your father in the war and the church in Lincolnshire, very quickly.
So my father was a navigator and a radio operator, and he was based at RAF Wellington in Lincolnshire. And coming back across the Channel, he was in the 50th Squadron, which was a bombing squadron at one point. And coming back across the Channel, he always told me there was this church that had a spire, and that actually was lit up. It was a beacon. And this beacon that he followed back to the aerodrome, RAF Waddington, which was at the base, this beacon was on the parish church in Carby, which was where Lily Carby and all his family were baptized, where his parents were married. Unfortunately, my father died before I could unravel that part of the story. But I realized that pursuing not just the people who were on the register who were enslaved, but the owner of this plantation, pursuing that story, which took me a long time to unravel, actually brought me right back to my father, and to many of the sort of questions about belonging that the book has raised, because my father always told me that when he saw the beacon on Colby Church as a navigator, he knew he was home in Britain.
And home is such a bittersweet thing in this book. And just there are a couple of questions we haven't got in, which I'm not going to ask. Did Charlotte Graves ask, did your parents come to terms with your mother's marriage? Well, you'll have to read the book, Charlotte, and you will find the answers there. And it will be, I promise you, it will be worth doing so. And another question, anonymous question, do you think your book can help address current concerns about British black history in the curriculum in the UK? To which I resoundingly say yes. So thank you, Hazel, for a fantastically enlightening talk. And thank you all in the audience for coming along.